let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like something was off in your intimate life, but you just couldn't put your finger on why? We're so often told that sexual health is, a simple mechanical thing, a biological issue, something a pill or a quick procedure can just fix. But what if I told you that's only a tiny, tiny piece of a much bigger, more intricate puzzle?
What if that feeling of low desire isn't just a glitch in your body's wiring, but a reflection of the silent messages you've been absorbing your entire life?
And is it really possible that the pressure from your 9 to 5 job is the biggest wall in your bedroom? A wall that affects not just you, but your partner too. Well, the answers are probably not what you're expecting. The research we're diving into today suggests we've been looking at this whole thing through a keyhole. It's time to open the door and see the entire room. So let's start with a story. This is Alex and Jordan. And maybe their story sounds a little familiar. They care about each other deeply, but that spark, that intimacy, it's just gone. They've done the rounds with doctors, they've had all the tests, and every time, the results come back the same. Everything's normal. So they're left feeling lost, frustrated, and worse, blaming themselves. They think it's a personal failure, but what they don't realize is that the problem isn't in them. It's in the box they've been put in. And this is how we start to break that box wide open. The World Health Organization gives us a much bigger, better definition. Sexual health isn't just about your body working correctly or not having an STI. It is a complete state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being. Think about that for a second. It's not just about what's happening inside you. It's about your feelings, your thoughts, your relationships, and your place in the world. That little word, social, is an absolute game changer. It tells us that our connections and our community are fundamental to our sexual selves. Now, to make sure you've got this, here's a quick question for you. Which of these 4 components was the most revolutionary addition to the definition of sexual health by the WHO? Is it A, physical, B, emotional, C, mental, or D, social? The answer is D, social. While all are crucial, explicitly including social well-being was a huge step forward, officially recognizing that our environment and relationships are key. Okay, so that idea of social well-being leads us perfectly into our first major topic, the invisible software that's running in the background of all our lives, our culture. You see, every single society has its own sexual script. It's an unwritten rulebook that tells us what's okay, what's hot, what's not, and even what counts as a problem in the first place. And just look at how dramatically that script can change depending on where you are in the world. In a lot of Western countries, the big complaints you hear about are things like low desire, erectile dysfunction, right? But in other places, the worries are totally different. Take Hot syndrome, which is a powerful anxiety centered on the loss of semen, found primarily on the Indian subcontinent. Or Koro syndrome, a terrifying panic that one's genitals are literally shrinking back into the body, which pops up in parts of Asia. These aren't even on the radar as dysfunctions in the West, but they cause very real, very intense suffering where those cultural beliefs are strong. Now for our next question. Koro syndrome, the fear of genital retraction, is an example of what? A, a universal sexual dysfunction, B, a culture-bound syndrome, C, a purely physical condition, or D, a common Western concern. The answer is B, a culture-bound syndrome. It's a perfect example of an anxiety that is deeply tied to specific cultural beliefs. All right, let's test that again. We just talked about Doth syndrome, that anxiety over semen loss. Where was this particular culture-bound syndrome first described? Was it A, the African subcontinent, B, South American, C, Indian, or D, European? And the answer is C, the Indian subcontinent. This is such a powerful example of how our cultural programming, our societal software, can generate real anxieties that just wouldn't compute in a different operating system. It proves there is no single universal problem list for sex. What we decide as a problem is shaped deeply by the world we live in. So what happens when these very different cultural scripts smash into the world of modern medicine? Well, you find yourself at a pretty intense ethical crossroads. This gets incredibly clear when we start to talk about the very complex and, let's be honest, sensitive topic of genital modification. And this question right here gets straight to the heart of a huge debate. On one side, you have the growing popularity of so-called designer vagina surgeries in the West, or female genital cosmetic surgery. It's framed as a personal, empowering choice. On the other side, you have traditional practices, often called female genital cutting, which are widely condemned as a violation of human rights. So are these two things fundamentally different, or are we maybe applying a bit of a double standard? To even begin to unpack that, we need a solid framework. And in the world of medicine, this is that framework. Ethical decisions are supposed to be guided by these 4 pillars. Autonomy is your right as a patient to call the shots. Non-maleficence is the famous one, first do no harm. Beneficence is the duty to act in the patient's best interest. And justice is all about fairness. These principles are like a moral compass for doctors, especially when the map gets really, really complicated. Time for a quick check-in. The principle of do no harm is central to medical ethics. What is its formal name? Is it A, autonomy, B, justice, C, beneficence, or D, non-maleficence? The answer is D, non-maleficence. It's one of the most ancient and important promises in medicine.
Now, to have an intelligent conversation about this, we have to be precise with our language. The World Health Organization classifies FGC into 4 main types. They range from type 1, which might involve the clitoral hood, all the way to type 3, infibulation, which involves creating a seal by cutting and repositioning the labia. It's really important to see this laid out factually, because the specifics of the procedure are at the center of the ethical storm. All right, another question for you. According to the WHO, which type of FGC involves narrowing the vaginal opening, also known as infibulation? Is it A, type 1, B, type 2, C, type 3, or D, type 4? The correct answer is C, type 3.
And that brings us to our second case study, a real-world ethical minefield. Picture this. A doctor is caring for an adult woman. As a child, she underwent type 3 FGC. She's just given birth, and in the process, the scar tissue is opened. Now she's asking the doctor to stitch her back up the way she was before. This is called refibulation. For her, this isn't about harm. It's about restoring her identity, her sense of self, her place within her own culture. The doctor's completely torn. The pillar of autonomy says respect your patient's choice, but the pillar of non-maleficence, do no harm, is screaming absolutely not. What is the right thing to do? There's no easy answer.
So let's boil this down to its ethical core. What is the single biggest difference, ethically speaking, between performing FGC on a child and performing a cosmetic labiaplasty on an adult? Is it A, the surgical tools that are used, B, the country where it happens, or is it C, the ability to provide informed consent? And the answer, without a doubt, is C, the ability to provide informed consent. This is the bright line. A child cannot, under any circumstances, truly consent. An adult, theoretically, can. This is why that principle of autonomy is so powerful and so central to the entire debate. Now, it doesn't magically solve our doctor's dilemma with the reinfibulation request, but it does draw a clear ethical line between something done to a person and something chosen by a person. All right, so we've looked at the massive, often invisible influence of culture and the tangled web of ethics. Now, let's bring it right back home to the day-to-day. Let's talk about something every single one of us deals with: stress. Because stress isn't just an event, right? It's our reaction to it, especially when we feel like we just can't cope. 56. What's so special about that number? Well, that's how many days in a row that 229 couples, all of whom were dealing with low sexual desire, kept a detailed diary. They tracked their stress, their desire, their satisfaction, every single day for almost 2 months. This wasn't just a snapshot. It was an intimate movie of their real lives. And the results were fascinating, as this slide shows. Here's the headline. On days when just one partner felt more stressed than usual, both of them reported lower sexual desire and satisfaction. Stress isn't a solo journey. It has a ripple effect. It's contagious. Think about it in real terms. Let's imagine Maria has a horrible, high-pressure deadline at work. She comes home totally drained and on edge. This study shows that even if her partner Sam had a fantastic day, Maria's stress is likely to lower his desire that night too. One person's bad day really can become both partners' problem in the bedroom. Let's check our understanding here. The main finding of the 56-day study was that one partner's stress affects A, only that partner, B, only the other partner, C, both partners, or D, neither partner. The clear answer is C, both partners. They called it a dyadic effect, meaning it's a shared experience. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that we have to start thinking about sexual health in a completely different way. You can call it psychobiosocial. I like to picture it as a 3-legged stool. You've got the bio, your body. You've got the psycho, your mind, your emotions, your stress. And you've got the social, your relationship, your culture. If any one of those legs is shaky, the whole stool gets wobbly. And understanding this deep connection, well, it means we need way better education for everyone. A quick question on that term. The psychobiosocial model suggests that health is determined by A, biology alone, B, psychology alone, C, social factors alone, or D, a combination of all three? And of course, the answer is D, a combination of all three.
Okay, so we've laid out the problems, right? We have a narrow medical view, these invisible cultural scripts running our lives, and the constant ripple effect of stress. The big question is, what's the solution? Where do we go from here? The answer lies in forging a new path to care, one that's a whole lot more human. For doctors and therapists, it starts by fundamentally changing the conversation. This slide gives some great guidelines. First, and most importantly, suspend your assumptions. Don't guess. Just ask people about their culture and what's important to them. Acknowledge that, hey, talking about sex can be awkward and difficult. And clarify what big words like love and commitment actually mean to them, because they don't mean the same thing to everyone. Honestly, these are fantastic rules not just for clinicians, but for any of us in our own relationships. So, what's the very first guideline for a culturally sensitive conversation? A, ask about culture, B, suspend preconceptions, C, acknowledge challenges, or D, clarify views on love? The answer is B, suspend preconceptions. You have to clear your own assumptions before you can truly listen. And that brings us back to Alex and Jordan, our couple from the beginning, who felt like a total failure. Well, their story has a much more hopeful ending. They found a therapist who used this bigger psychobiosocial approach, and the therapist helped them see something profound. Their low desire wasn't a dysfunction. It was a completely normal response to all the invisible pressures of their jobs, their stress, and the expectations of their culture. So they started tackling stress as a team. And by finally addressing the real roots of the problem, they started to find their way back to each other. Last question. What was the key shift in perspective that helped Alex and Jordan? A, finding the right medication. B, realizing one of them was to blame. C, seeing their issue as a response to stress, not a personal failure. Or D, deciding their relationship was over. The answer, thankfully, is C. They reframed the problem, and that changed everything. So, as we wrap this up, let's just quickly recap the top takeaways. First, sexual health is so much more than just biology. It's a three-legged stool of body, mind, and social world. Second, our culture writes these incredibly powerful invisible scripts that tell us what's normal and what's not. And third, our daily stress doesn't just belong to us, it ripples out and affects our partners too. And that brings us to the final, most important question, the one for you to take with you. Knowing all of this, what are the invisible factors from your culture, from your personal ethics, from your daily stress that might be shaping your own story? And how might just seeing them for what they are change everything? Before you go, we want to give a special thanks to the London HeartbeatsZ Eurasia Academy in the UK for their amazing educational support. If you want to dive deeper into topics like this, I highly recommend you explore their more than 150 popular courses. Make sure to subscribe to their social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, for free, regular updates so you don't miss out on future discussions. And for those who are really serious about learning, a higher level YouTube membership gets you early access to videos and even personal chats and guidance sessions. Thanks so much for joining me.